So Beth Singler is the postdoc research associate here working with Peter and I, with me on the project. Her background is in religious studies and in new religions, and she's has an interest in science fiction in particular, and is going to talk to us on that topic.
Okay, so we've been discussing a lot about what artificial intelligence can increasingly do, and one of the things that in the last year or so, artificial intelligence has got better at pattern recognition. So I want to see how you humans do at pattern recognition. I'm going to show you a series of slides, and I would like it if you could raise your hand once you notice the repeating pattern. You may also notice a familiar face at some point as well. Let's see if this works. Okay. There's one. There's a face. Yeah, some people are getting it, or people shy. Okay, oops, too far. Okay, so obviously these are mainstream newspaper articles about the future or potential future of artificial intelligence, and 2 or 1, they use images from the Terminator films. Now, sorry if this is boring for some of you, but I'm just going to very quickly summarize the plot of the Terminator films, starting with the first in 1984. So, this first film proposes that in America, an artificial intelligence defense system called Skynet becomes sentient once it's turned on. It immediately wipes out the majority of humanity, 3 billion people, through our own nuclear weapons, which it has access to as a defense system. After this Judgment Day, as it's termed, the remnants of humanity band together under the leadership of John Connor. Skynet develops time travel technology and sends back a Terminator android to kill John Connor's mother, Sarah, who's the lady at the top. So to rescue Sarah, Carl Reese is sent back in time. He is John Connor's best friend, as he's sent back to a point in time even before Sarah's pregnant with John Connor. And would you believe it, they fall in love and conceive John Connor himself. Carl Reese dies, unfortunately, sacrificing himself for Sarah before he even finds out that he has impregnated her with his best friend. He then, in the following film, Sarah has trained herself up. She's been doing a lot of exercise at the gym. She's much buffer, much more used to weapons. And she has tried to prepare her son, John Connor, for his future as the potential savior of the human race. Events in Terminator Judgment Day, the second film, unfortunately leads not to the prevention of this event, the apocalyptic destruction of humanity by artificial intelligence, unfortunately, but its postponement. Further films in 2003, 2009, 2013, and a TV series, Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, from 2008 to 2009, continue this theme of postponement, with even the most heroic acts only delaying the inevitable conflagration, or in some cases, accidentally helping to bring it about. I'm afraid, Peter, in science fiction, it's not that easy to pull the plug on artificial intelligence when it's destructive. Therefore, in a sense, Judgment Day, as presented in the science fiction, is inevitable. Perhaps the immediate response to this point would be to note that this is a commercial film franchise, and we don't want the end of the story if we're trying to make money out of it. But there are also religious parallels that I believe are valuable to consider. Judgment Day is obviously based on the biblical term Day of Judgment, a time of catastrophe, election, and proving in many interpretations. And we can note in the later installments of this film franchise, we get episodes called Terminator Salvation and Terminator Genesis. So here we have images. The top is, if you can make it out, is the conflagration of when Skynet wakes up and drops nuclear bombs on our heads. The second is the Islamic interpretation of the Day of Judgment. And the third is a piece of art by John Martin, based upon aspects of Revelation, and that was painted around 1851 or 1853. So going back to Terminator, the parallels we can draw out include the ideas of receiving news from a stranger who is out of his normal place, of a special child that Sarah Connor is going to bear, and a prophecy of this AI apocalypse that is to come. This conception is also, in a sense, fated. With time travel and all those wonderful paradoxes, Carl Reese becomes his friend's father, the friend who will eventually send him back in time to become his own father, etc., for potentially ever after. Although fated, there's no suggestion in the films that John Connor or the nature of his conception are supernatural or divine in any way. We can perhaps describe this religious troping as rather shallow, and Cameron has a lot to answer for. But the point remains that just as conceptions of science and technology are influenced by science fiction, as in the news articles I've shown you, science fiction picks up on existing narratives, religious, biblical, and mythological. So to illustrate this interplay, here are the spheres, you can see those, of science fiction and what I'm going to call science fact. I've shortened it to science fact, but it also includes speculations that do not describe themselves as fictions. So predictions into the future based on current science. Science fact, it's not entirely factual. So ideas about AI and robotics exist in both, and I've shortened that just to AI here for simplicity and because it fits better on my diagram. AI is a place where these two spheres regularly overlap, I argue. So, for example, in Garachi's 2010 ethnographic study of AI technologists, he points out their broad science fiction literacy that informs their work and their aims. He also concludes that apocalyptic claims, that's a Freudian slip, apocalyptic claims amongst technologists justify public support and enhance the prestige of research. For example, a graduate student pointed out to Garachi that apocalyptic promises make your project look shiny. Or further, he states, one of the chief aims of apocalyptic AI has been to elevate the social status of the author. You should care what he has to say because he is an important person, a master of the technology that will dominate our future and save us from confusion, ignorance, and death. Is there a sphere missing here? And there it is. We have noted the religious troping in science fiction. Is religion another sphere of interaction that overlaps in the subject of AI and robots more generally? Garachi draws attention to the prophetic role of technologists, saying that such claims, if true, elevate roboticists and AI researchers, especially those prophets of the apocalyptic future, to the highest spiritual and political echelons possible. If they can bring about such events, surely these technological wizards are among the very elite of society. Religion needs our consideration as a sphere of influence, particularly in terms of Judeo-Christian and Muslim eschatologies, but further for how such religious images, tropes, and ideas inspire and influence other, often overtly secular technological narratives. So to recap, we've briefly seen the influence of religion on science fiction through the example of the Terminator films, this way. But the arrow can go both ways. So, for example, and this is a group you may not have heard of before, the new religious movement, going both ways, the Church of All Worlds. The Church of All Worlds has become entangled more with Wicca and paganism in its contemporary form, but it began its life in the 1961 science fiction novel Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, wherein a human being is raised on Mars and brings the Martian religion back to Earth with him, and it spreads and becomes very popular. Oberon and Morning Glory Zell Ravenheart, these two individuals here, were amongst those who tried to enact in the real world the communal living and awareness of the sacredness of nature that they saw in that book by Heinlein. Among their particular projects was the creation of a real-life unicorn, as in this picture. They did this by training the horns of goats to grow together over time. The Zell Ravenhearts wanted unicorns to exist so much that they went out and created them. Likewise, they wanted the religion described by Heinlein to exist so much that they created it. Science fiction concretely influenced their lived religion. Could we call this pragmatic religion? Well, I use this term cautiously to avoid proliferating new terms in social anthropology. What a horrible idea. However, the research I do on groups inspired by science fiction and science and technology can be said to follow in the same line of research as work on invented religions, such as Cusack in 2010, pop culture religions, and hyper-real religions, citing Posmai from 2012. Other examples would be Jediism, Discordianism, and Scientology. And here on the right is the issue of astounding science fiction, where L. Ron Hubbard's work on Dianetics first appeared, where he presented it as science in a science fiction publication. And of course, Dianetics in time led to the more familiar Church of Scientology. There is a further third interplay where we see the influence of religion on science fact or speculations and vice versa. This is a slide from a presentation presented on my slide during this presentation about the desire to create a religion for transhumanists, those who have a very particular idea about the intersection between the evolution of mankind and technology such as artificial intelligence. This presentation here was given by Julio Prisco at the 2014 Mormon Humanist Conference. Here we see a discussion of the possibility, again, of creating unicorns. The unicorn here, however, is standing in for religion for Prisco. Religion is, in the view of him, an enchanting and pleasing but ultimately unreal entity. The author suggests that science, in the form of biotechnology, robotics, or virtual reality, might in time create the unicorn. The extension of this idea is that we might create religion through science for Prisco. I'll return to this idea, but first I want to briefly define transhumanism, as it's come up a few times. Transhumanism is the belief or theory that the human race can evolve beyond its current physical and mental limitations, especially by means of science and technology. Transhumanism can hope to apply a variety of actual and potential technologies to these problems, including the possibility of mind uploading or artificial intelligence as an optimal decision-making machine, the ultimate rational agent. I argue that theories around the coming super artificial intelligence or singularity among future tech-focused groups replicate religious eschatology, even if they are themselves overtly secular in stance. They have more in common with new religious movements than they might like to admit. For example, what are the specific aims of Prisco's paper? I've highlighted some statements from his slides here. He says, transhumanism must embrace the promise of resurrection in afterlife to be achieved by future science and technology. These achievements, he says, include developments through and with artificial intelligence, such as mind uploading. He says again, we need new, positive, solar, action-orientated spiritual movements based on science to keep us enthusiastic, motivated, and energetic as we take the first steps to the cosmic frontier. On this slide, we have an outline of Prisco's cosmology. He says, I'm persuaded that we will go to the stars and find gods, build gods, become gods, and resurrect the dead from the past with advanced science, space-time engineering, and time magic. This being magic in the sense of Arthur C. Clarke's third law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's not the primitive form of magic for Prisco. In the following slide, Prisco makes a call for his listeners to declare their following of what he describes as theism from deism, his core scientific, spiritual, religious vision. This is the idea that this is a universe run on scientifically identifiable rules, devoid of deities, but where we might find or create them. I have another example. Roko's Basilisk. I'm afraid by telling you about this, I am dooming you. I'm very sorry about that, but it's necessary sometimes to provide information that's a bit risky. So this has been described in some publications here, for example, as the most terrifying thought experiment of all time. It's considered, much like the European myth of the Basilisk, to freeze you, to permanently doom you to a specific fate. It appears to have originated in the online musings of one person within a future tech-focused community, but the tenets that this individual was building upon involve theories of intelligence, of superintelligence, of technological evolution, of strict moral utilitarianism, effective altruism, and of artificial simulation. And these are ideas that have been previously explored in the work of several popular science writers. Very, very briefly, Roko's Basilisk proposes that the forthcoming singularity or super artificial intelligence will necessarily punish for eternity all those who did not contribute towards its creation. Hello, Skynet, again, in a sense. This raises two questions. Well, why, obviously? It's based on a presumption that a strict moral utilitarianism is the most logical ethic for the world and the super artificial intelligence. Therefore, not working towards the superintelligence risks harm for humanity that the AI in existing would prevent. And therefore, humanity must be incentivized through eternal punishment, or the threat of it, to bring about the super artificial intelligence. And how will this happen? How will this punishment happen? Again, another presumption that the future involves perfect mind copying and simulation. This is not an uncommon concept in AI speculations, but employed this time in the creation of a hell, an eternal punishment for those who do not act in a particular way. So we can imagine this laid out in this particular way in this table, the wager of Roko's Basilisk. You work to bring about the singularity. If the singularity doesn't come into being, you've not really lost anything. If it does, you've avoided eternal torment. If you don't choose to bring about the singularity, you risk eternal torment or nothing. This square would appear to be weighted towards an outcome of nothing, as 3 of the 4 options lead to this, although it is possible, perhaps, that the singularity might also choose to reward those who have worked towards its creation, although Roko's Basilisk as a thought experiment and its strict moral utilitarianism do not necessarily suggest this kind of benevolence. However, acting as though the Basilisk will exist works towards its creation, enhancing the probability that it will come into being and thus justifying your original decision. The question is then, how can we understand this belief in an acausally threatening superintelligence from the future that's going to stick you in an eternal hell? Well, there are certainly uses of religious categories here, and members of the website where this thought experiment was first posted were not unaware of this. So some specifically called this idea of presentation of AI as a capricious god. Someone else said, I have been familiar with Roko's Basilisk for 40 years. They taught me the concept in Sunday school in the 1st grade by telling me that God would punish anyone who heard his word and still disbelieved. Nearly every religion has such a claim. There are also comparisons made with personality cults, such as Scientology previously mentioned. And there is also community awareness of similarities of Roko's Basilisk with Pascal's wager. Again, you may be already familiar with this. The decision to believe that God exists can lead to eternal happiness. If God doesn't happen to exist, then you've lost nothing. If you choose not to believe, you're risking eternal torment. But if God doesn't exist, again, you're risking nothing. Oh, sorry. And just to follow on to that, members of these groups often use some of the same arguments that are used against Pascal's wager to try and defeat Roko's Basilisk, such as the suggestion that perhaps there's Roko's rooster as well that will punish you if you try and bring about Roko's Basilisk, so you're lost either way. It's lots of fun. To summarise, I have described the interactions between science fiction and science fact and introduced the sphere of religion to the discussion so that there is a multi-directional range of interactions, with AI as the central point to these overlapping spheres where all these different elements have expression and influence on each other. Why is considering these overlapping spheres so important? We need to recognise the role of religion, particularly in its eschatological forms, in the development of our understanding of artificial intelligence and robotics, in order to highlight the continuation of the sacred in an anthropological sense, in the apparently and even overtly secular framework of technologists. We need to know what ideologies are driving technological developments which might literally change the world, even if they don't bring about an apocalyptic judgment day. Religion has a continuing influence and relevance to the discussions around AI and robotics. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Beth. So, questions or comments?
You might confine yourself to Christian eschatology. And I was thinking of Frank Commode's book, The Sense of an Ending, which explores the narrative structures of religious exegesis and its consequences in literature and entailed storytelling. Because otherwise, I read that, I see that argument, I think what you're proposing is essentially a Christian exegesis as the universal exegesis for technological trains and so forth. And you feel like saying that surely that wasn't the case when say, Aristotle was writing, was not the same patterns.
For the context of these groups, although they are overtly secular, they are coming from predominantly from a Christian West or even a Judaic background. So even if they describe themselves as perhaps certainly not religious, not even spiritual but not religious, but certainly not religious, that is still the context where these ideas are leaking into their descriptions of the future and their teleological understanding of humankind's evolution and a potential day or a moment or a singularity point of change. So I take your point, but in this instance, their context is certainly Western, originally Christian, even if that's rejected.
I'd just like to add that, in fact, one of the sub-questions of the project that we're doing is to ask the question whether different cultural responses to artificial intelligence and robotics, including to fictional responses, is somehow related to the deeper cultural heritage. So it's very interesting to me that it is said, and there appears to be some evidence for this, that particularly in Japan, and probably in China as well, that there is a much greater openness to robots and much less of this dystopic narrative. Whereas time and time again, it's the dystopic narratives which repeatedly emerge in the West. And one possible explanation for this is that in Japanese culture, particularly from an animistic perception, where everything has a spirit, everything has its own reason. It could be that, therefore, this humanoid thing has its own spirit, it's something to be accepted and welcomed, and there's not a problem. Whereas in the Judeo-Christian cultural heritage, there is this sense that there's something special about being human, and anything that somehow threatens my specialness is some form of hubris, and is ultimately going to end in tears. So it'd be interesting, whether that's true or not, I really don't know, and I'm going to be interested if other people think that these cross-cultural...
Well, Japan's not without its dystopian.
Yes, I understand, that's right, that Japan does have dystopian things. Stephen at the back?
Shall I just comment on that? I can raise my voice if you want. If I might comment quickly on that. Excuse me. It's also the case that, you know, H.G. Wells, you know I'm interested in him, sometimes called the father of science fiction, begins writing in the 1890s in a serious way, when the impact of Darwinism after the ascent of man, the origin of species earlier, ascent of man, was hitting people very hard, huge disillusionment with Christianity, I mean, and a fear on the part of many people, and Wells was prescient about what was happening in the world in terms of the arms race and things of that kind. There was in, therefore, Western culture, at the time of the origins of science fiction, just vast anxiety about what was happening in the world at the time, as a matter of fact. That, I guess, carried over.
And that anxiety, can you just be more precise about the anxiety?
Well, the anxiety is brought about by a number of factors, I think. One was the kind of Nietzschean sense, which began to grow in the 1890s in terms of influence, that God was dead, therefore there was no moral objectivity, no center to the world in terms of values or anything. The growing militarism in Germany, and of course many people in Britain blamed what the German people were doing for the outcome of the First World War, whether or not that was fair. There was a worry about what was happening there. A lot of insanity becoming public in Europe at the time, and a crisis of faith quite generally. It was the birth of a new world for many people, intellectually and morally. The old was certainly gone for many, but what was there now? What was ahead of us? And people were just very, very uncertain.
Yeah.
That's the surface of it anyway.
Well, obviously, Wells is very, very important, but I think with science fiction historiography, you can also look at Hirschkine's idea that it goes back to Poe as well as an originator for science fiction, also the influence of Shelley as well. So I think there's some currents there that you're very correct around, but I think there's some earlier points as well where some of these ideas start to feed into Wells as well. But we could discuss that later if anyone else.
Okay, I'll discuss Poe with you later. Yeah.
Okay, any question there? Thanks.
I have a question from the point of view of realized eschatology. Realized eschatology, do you see a certain kind of realization of a certain failure or a certain fallibility in pursuing some of the goals and ideals of religion as it comes in a very dystopic manner in some of these fictional narratives, and there is a certain kind of displacement or a move away from religion? And that actually also shows to some extent that a particular body of religion is not able to pursue the eschatological goal that it ultimately had given itself to. And therefore there's a total absence of eschatology in such fiction, and thereby further problematizing the very structure of faith.
Well, I don't think there is an absence of eschatology in this fiction or in these future tech focus groups that I'm talking about in the transhumanist narrative. I think it's an overt attempt to be secular with leaking in of ideas that they overtly reject. So you may have an argument there about them perhaps not seeing within other religions something that is appealing or attractive that they want to investigate, and then in many instances they cite rationality as the reason why they're not religious, that religions are not rational. They are pursuing the highest human aim of rationality, and religion needs to be left behind. I mean, that's the rhetoric. But but I think they are still using some of the same shapes, whether they are always conscious of it or not.
Thanks very much. Any other comments or questions? Well, thanks very much, Beth, and let's say thank you.